5:30 in the morning. The house is still dark. Her husband is still asleep in the guest room. This is Sarah's time with God. 22 years of marriage. 2 kids, both grown. A husband who's faithful, who provides, who's never raised his voice. On paper, everything looks fine. But paper doesn't show the silence that's grown between them like a wall. 3 years ago, Sarah's mother died. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. And during those months, Sarah needed her husband in a way she'd never needed him before. She needed him to just sit with her, to let her cry without trying to fix it. But he didn't know how. He'd bring tea and suggest walks. He'd remind her that her mother was with God now, and Sarah knew he meant well. But his best wasn't what she needed, and something broke between them that never healed. 6 months after the funeral, Sarah started praying. Real prayers. On her knees. She prayed for her marriage, for connection to come back, for her husband to see her pain instead of trying to solve it. Month 1, she prayed with hope. Month 12, she prayed with desperation. Month 24, she prayed with numbness. Last month, her husband suggested marriage counseling. Sarah said no. She told him they didn't need a counselor, they needed God. But late at night, Sarah knows the truth. She said no because she's terrified. Terrified that counseling will reveal her part in this. That maybe she pulled away too. That maybe she's been punishing him for 3 years for not knowing how to comfort her in a way she never taught him to give. Terrified they'll find something worse than distance, indifference, and indifference can't be fixed by prayer. There's something else Sarah hasn't told anyone. 8 months ago, she started working at a bookstore. There's a regular customer named Tom. Divorced, 50s, kind in the way her husband used to be. They've never done anything wrong. Never touched beyond a handshake. Never met outside the store. But in her head, Sarah has had entire conversations with Tom that she'll never have with her husband. In her head, Tom sees her. Really sees her. And 3 weeks ago, lying awake at 3 in the morning, Sarah let herself think it. What if I married the wrong person? What if God has someone else for me? And the moment she thought it, guilt crashed over her. She's a Christian woman, married in church, made vows before God. And here she is, entertaining fantasies about another man. She hasn't done anything wrong, but she wants to. And wanting feels like betrayal. The questions come harder now. Did I do something wrong? Maybe God is silent because she's holding on to Tom in her thoughts. Or maybe God is silent because he's disappointed in her for saying counseling was beneath them when really, she was just scared. Do I even want this marriage anymore? If she's honest, brutally honest, she's not sure. Comfort isn't the same as love. And she doesn't know if what she feels is love or just decades of habit. And if she doesn't want it, why is she praying for it? Is she praying because she wants it restored? Or because she's supposed to want it restored? And then the thought that terrifies her most. What if I've wasted my life? Sarah is 47. If she's lucky, she has 30 good years left. She spent the first 47 trying to be the good Christian wife, the good Christian mother. But who is she underneath all that? There's a manuscript in her desk drawer, half finished, a novel she started 15 years ago. She wrote 3 chapters, got pregnant, and life happened. Sometimes she opens the drawer just to look at it. Proof that once she had dreams. But every time she tries to write now, nothing comes. Because she doesn't know if she still believes in that story, or if it was just fantasy from a younger, more naive version of herself. So she closes the drawer, stares at the closed Bible, and realizes something that makes her hands shake. She's not angry at God for not answering. She's angry at herself for asking, because asking means hoping, and hoping means being vulnerable to disappointment. And Sarah has been disappointed too many times. By her mother dying too young, by her husband not knowing how to love her grief, by her own inability to be satisfied with a life everyone says should be enough. One Sunday, the pastor preaches about prayer, about how God always answers. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes wait. And people nod and say, "Amen." And Sarah sits there thinking, what if there's no good answer? What if some marriages can't be saved? What if God is silent because He's waiting for me to accept what is, instead of begging for what isn't? She drives home, parks in the garage, sits with the engine off. Maybe the problem isn't that God won't answer. Maybe the problem is that God already answered, and the answer is no. She walks into the empty house, stands in the kitchen where she's prayed 1,000 prayers. Sarah's story isn't new. There was a man named Job. Not the patient Job who got everything back doubled. That's the ending. We need to talk about the middle. Job lost everything. And when he cried out to God, God was silent. But here's what we don't talk about. Job's wife told him to curse God and die. Job's friends told him he must have sinned. And Job sat in the ashes and said something we're not comfortable with. God has wronged me. Job chapter 19, verse 6. Job accused God of injustice, of cruelty, and God didn't strike him down. For 35 chapters, God let Job rage, let him question, let him say things that would make most church people uncomfortable. And through all of it, God was silent. When God finally spoke, He didn't explain why Job's children died. He didn't justify the suffering. Instead, God said, "Look at creation. Look at the mystery. Realize that I am God and you are not." And somehow, that was enough. Not because the suffering made sense, but because Job realized his demand for answers was based on an assumption that if he was righteous enough, God owed him a good life. And God was teaching him something deeper. That faith isn't a transaction. That sometimes God lets the innocent suffer and doesn't explain Himself. Job got his life back at the end. But we forget something. His first children were still dead. The new children didn't replace them. The suffering still happened. There's another story about Hannah. Hannah was barren. She went to the temple year after year. She prayed. She wept. She begged God for a son. And for years, God was silent. Finally, God answered. She had Samuel, who became a prophet. We point to this as proof that persistent prayer works. But we forget something. After years of begging for a son, Hannah gave him away. She weaned him and brought him to the temple and left him there. The son she prayed for, she raised for 3 years and then handed over. Why? Because somewhere in the years of waiting, Hannah's prayer changed. It stopped being, "God, give me a son so I can be valued." It became, "God, if you give me a son, I'll give him back to you." The waiting transformed the prayer. And the answer God gave wasn't to the first prayer, it was to the second. What these stories tell you is something harder than God always answers. Sometimes God's silence is because He's waiting for you to ask the right question, or to stop asking altogether and start listening, or to realize that what you're asking for isn't actually what you need. God's silence is not God's absence, but it's also not always God saying, "Wait for what you asked for." Sometimes it's God saying, What you're asking for is based on what you think you need, not what I know you need. Sometimes it's God saying, I'm not going to fix this situation because I'm trying to fix you. And sometimes, the hardest one, it's God saying, no, this thing you want is not going to happen, and you need to grieve it and move forward. Let's talk about why this is so hard. When you're young, prayer feels simple. You call, God answers. But by the time you're 40, 50, you've prayed enough prayers that didn't get answered the way you wanted. You've buried people you prayed would be healed. You've watched marriages you prayed would be saved end in divorce. And at some point, you have to reckon with a question. Is God not answering because I'm not praying right? Or because God has different plans than I do? Or because God doesn't work the way I was taught He works? This is terrifying, because your faith was built on assumptions. That if you follow God, He'll bless you. That if you're righteous, He'll protect your family. That if you pray in faith, mountains will move. But life taught you different. You've been faithful and still lost what you loved. You've been righteous and still suffered. You've prayed in faith and watched the mountain stay exactly where it was. Here's what no one tells you when you're younger. God never promised to make your life easy. He never promised that faith prevents suffering. He never promised that if you're good enough, you'll get what you want. What God promised is that He would be with you. Not that He would fix everything, just that He would be present. And when you're in pain, that feels cruel, because presence without intervention feels like watching, and watching feels like indifference. But here's the deeper truth. Sometimes God's presence means sitting with you in the pain, not removing it. Sometimes it means letting you wrestle with hard questions instead of giving easy answers. Sometimes it means watching you make mistakes, because making mistakes is part of becoming who you're meant to be. If you have adult children, you know this. You watch them struggle. You could intervene. You could fix it. But you don't. Not because you don't love them, because you do love them. And you know that if you fix everything, they'll never learn. They'll never develop the strength that only comes from struggle. God does the same. Not because He's cruel, because He's patient. Patient enough to let you wrestle until you ask the question underneath the question. Patient enough to let you sit in silence until you stop filling it with demands and start filling it with listening. In the silence, you learn that maybe you've been praying for God to change your circumstances when God is trying to change you. That maybe the real prayer isn't "fix this," but "teach me how to live in this." This doesn't mean God is playing games. It means God is playing the long game, where the goal isn't your happiness, it's your wholeness. So what do you do with this? First, you stop trying to fix yourself. Stop searching for the hidden sin. God's silence is not about your inadequacy. It's about His refusal to be controlled. You can't manipulate God into answering by being good enough. Second, you grieve. This is what we don't talk about in church. When God says no, or doesn't say anything, you need to grieve what you're not going to have. Sarah needs to grieve the marriage she thought she'd have, the intimacy she hoped would return. She needs to sit with the reality that her husband might never be the partner she needs. And that's not his fault or hers, it's just the painful truth. And grieving, that is holy work. It's not giving up on God. It's accepting what is instead of exhausting yourself fighting for what isn't. Third, you ask the harder question. Not, God, why won't you fix this? But God, what are you trying to teach me that I can only learn in the not fixed? Maybe God is teaching Sarah that she doesn't need her husband to see her for her to be whole. That her worth isn't determined by whether someone loves her well. Or maybe God is teaching her that it's okay to admit the marriage is over. That staying in something dead doesn't make you faithful. It makes you afraid. Or maybe God is teaching her she's been asking the wrong question. She's been asking God to change her husband when what she needs is permission to change herself, to finish that novel, to take responsibility for her own wholeness. Fourth, you stay in the tension. You don't have to resolve everything today. You can sit in the ambiguity, in the not knowing. Faith doesn't mean having all the answers. It means learning to live with the questions. And maybe the most mature faith is the faith that says, I don't know what God is doing. I don't know if this marriage will survive. I don't know what my life is supposed to look like. But I'm still here. I'm still showing up. I'm still choosing to believe God is present, even when He's silent. If today you're still in the silence, you haven't failed. You've arrived. You've arrived at the place where faith is no longer about getting what you want from God. It's about trusting who God is when you don't get what you want. And that's the hardest place to be. It's also the most honest. Sarah still wakes up at 5:30. The house is still dark. Her husband is still in the guest room. But something is different. Not in her circumstances. In her. She opens the Bible again. Not because she expects an answer today. Not because she believes God is going to swoop in and fix everything. Not because she's certain of anything anymore, but because she's learning something she never could have learned any other way. That sometimes God's greatest gift is not giving you what you ask for, because what you ask for is shaped by who you are now. And God is more interested in who you're becoming, and who you're becoming only emerges in the waiting, in the not knowing, in the silence. She doesn't know if her marriage will survive. She doesn't know if she wants it to. She doesn't know if Tom is a temptation to resist or a sign that something needs to change. She doesn't know if she should go to counseling or file for divorce or just keep waking up at 5:30 and sitting in the dark. She doesn't know, and maybe that's okay. Maybe faith at 47 looks different than faith at 27. Maybe it's less certain, less tidy, less about having the right answers, and more about being willing to sit with the questions. Maybe mature faith is the faith that can say, I don't understand what you're doing, God. I don't like it. I'm angry and confused and exhausted. But I'm still here. God has not left you. Even when He's silent, He's working. Not always on your circumstances, but always on you. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not this year, maybe not until you're looking back from the other side of your life, you'll realize that the silence wasn't empty. It was full of God reshaping you into someone who doesn't need all the answers, someone who can live with uncertainty, someone whose faith is strong enough to hold questions without breaking. That's the gift on the other side of unanswered prayer. Not the answer you wanted, but the person you needed to become. The person who knows that God is enough, even when He's silent, especially when He's silent.